Welcome to Fear Street. Me and my wife were walking a bridle trail, bow hunting, in Nipissing Swamp State Natural Area, when I started to feel like we were being watched. I kept it to myself, however, and we continued walking the trail until we reached a point where the path branched off to the right, and a snowmobile trail went to the left. I went to that corner the last few days, but always stopped because I just had an odd feeling about continuing. We had just moved to Two Rivers a few months ago and weren't familiar with the area. We had just started hunting there a few days prior, and the odd feeling had been enough to convince me to turn back on previous excursions. This time, though, something convinced me to ignore that feeling and go further. As my wife and I reached the fork, something not far off the trail ran off through the woods. It seemed so big, I felt it in the ground. Believing it must be a large buck, we proceeded down the trail, hoping to get a glimpse of it. We found it about 50 yards up, where the trail opened into a stand of tall pines. It was behind a tree, and at first appeared to be a bear standing on its back legs, scratching its back against the tree trunk. It kept stepping to the side, and I could see what looked like a shoulder and a really long arm. But it looked black, really black. Then it did something funny, almost like it got down on all fours, and I thought I saw what would be its head, but it was very oddly shaped, almost like a football, but horizontal, with very long ears pointing up into the back. And I thought what I believed to be very long, almost grayish hair. I estimate it to be 8 to 10 feet tall, with long, thin, gangly arms. My wife and I watched it briefly, unable to understand what we were looking at. Then it took 3 large steps and disappeared into the underbrush. We slowly walked toward the tree where the creature had been standing, where we saw large impressions in the ground. I thought maybe it had been another hunter dressed in a ghillie suit, though I knew it was way too tall to be human. "Hello?" I said quietly. There was no response. I called out a few more times, but there was only silence. We decided we'd better get out of there because it was starting to get dark and we were both pretty freaked out. All the way back, it felt like somebody was trailing us alongside the trail, keeping up with us as we walked very fast. About a quarter mile from the road where our vehicle was parked, my wife and I walked out of the forest into a field. We saw a deer there, standing sideways, out in the open. A perfect shot. We had come out to hunt, after all. So I raised my bow and nocked an arrow. I used lighted knocks so you could easily see the trajectory of my arrow. When I shot, you could see that I shot low, and I heard something like my arrow hitting something. But I wasn't sure if I hit the deer or not, so we walked over there and started looking for my arrow, still constantly watching around us, and we couldn't find my arrow anywhere. Then I spotted the glowing knock about 20 or 30 yards back toward the woods and the path. My arrow was stuck, basically vertical in the ground, except leaning the opposite way I shot, which to me and my wife seemed impossible, that my arrow could be the way it was in the ground. As we made our way back toward the road to leave, a strong odor filled the air. I smelled the most horrible smell I've ever smelled in my life, like rot and mud and sulfur. A nasty smell that was just right in my face. My wife smelled it as well and later described it to me as a very strong metallic odor of something metal. We hurried back to our vehicle and headed home, but that night still haunts me. I'm a very avid bow hunter and have spent most of my life out in the woods. I've never encountered anything like this or felt the feeling I felt when I was out there. This experience left me feeling uneasy about going back out into the woods, and I'm questioning whether I'll ever go out hunting again. I spend a lot of time camping and hiking in the mountains of northern Georgia with my brother Ryan. On this particular day, we headed out to a place we knew well, midway through Jack's River Trail in the Cohutta Wilderness. We searched for a good secluded area to set up camp for a planned 2-night stay. We got everything set up, and after a day of hiking and exploring the Jack's River, the trip seemed to be off to a great start. That night, we got a fire going, had dinner, and sat chatting away until a sound caught our attention. We were very familiar with the sounds of the forest, but this sounded off to us. It was as if several people were walking around the campsite, trying not to be heard. Then things got very bizarre. I remember we both pulled out our flashlights and shined them in the direction we felt the sounds were coming from. But that's what was so weird. Whenever we'd fix our lights on a spot we thought the sounds were coming from, the location of the sound would suddenly change. That's when the whistling started. At first, I thought it was the wind, and I remember thinking maybe the wind is just throwing leaves around and what we're hearing is nothing but the wilderness around us. Ryan looked at me and asked if I was hearing it. I didn't answer and was trying to focus hard on each individual sound. 2 consecutive notes with roughly a 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes over and over again. Ryan kept asking if I heard it, and I put my finger to my lips, trying to keep him quiet. The fear I felt was incredible. My jaw was tight, my fist clenched, knowing I wasn't ready for whatever was out there, if it was anything at all. The whistling continued for what felt like forever, but thinking it through, it was maybe 5 minutes when Ryan finally yelled out into the darkness, "Hey! Quiet!" The whistling stopped. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, when suddenly the woods erupted with noise. Something or someone was running in a circle around our campsite. The whistling came back. 2 consecutive notes with the same 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes. How could someone whistle this loudly without cracking while also running? I was done. I stood up, shining my flashlight in all directions, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was screwing with us. Nothing. It felt close enough to touch, but we never saw a thing. That's when the movement stopped, but the whistling was still constant. It was so loud, inhumanly loud. I looked at Ryan and told him to call the police. Now, this is the part I'll never forget, the part I never like to talk about. While Ryan was on the phone with the dispatcher and telling them our location and what was going on, I stepped around the fire towards my tent. Inside my bag, I had a 6-inch fixed blade that I always carried and thought I'd feel a bit more comfortable with it in my hand, more than just my flashlight. As I went to unzip my tent, trying to keep my eyes toward the woods, I heard some movement directly in front of me. I swept my light up in front of me, and for maybe 2 seconds, I saw it. Whatever this person or thing was, it was about 5 feet up in a tree. Everything about it was long. Its arms, legs, neck, fingers, everything. And it was fast. As soon as the light hit it, it launched backwards off the tree. I heard it land, but it either jumped an impossible distance or landed in a thicket, because I heard it, but never saw. I don't think I've ever yelled so loudly. I ran back to where Ryan was and sat down. He kept asking me what I saw, but I couldn't answer. I just kept thinking about it. Maybe 10 minutes later, we saw a couple of flashlight beams coming through the woods, and about 3 guys came into view, asking if everything was okay. I settled down a bit and started asking them if they had seen or heard anything. All they said was they heard a lot of movement, and then they heard my scream. That's when they headed our direction. I tried to explain what had happened without sounding crazy, but it didn't seem to work. One of the guys walked around a bit and came back and said he didn't see anything. Ryan told them that we called the police, and roughly 30 minutes later, a park ranger showed up. Ryan and I tried explaining everything to him, but he just chalked it up to either a curious animal or some campers trying to mess with us. It all started with finding mutilated animals around my property in a rather grisly fashion, including dead foxes and deer that had had their spinal columns torn out and strewn around, as well as vicious claw and teeth marks and limbs rendered from their bodies. Sometimes these animals were disemboweled, and their entrails found hanging from bushes or trees like macabre Christmas tree ornaments. And sometimes they were simply torn in half, with one of the halves missing. It was all very unsettling indeed, but it was about to graduate into the horrifying. So let me lay out the land for you. My house is about 100 yards from a small stream that splits the small wooded area in half. On the far side of the stream from my house, there are large trees. I was out there one day, and all of a sudden, I felt cold and uncomfortable, like I was being watched. I also became increasingly paranoid that someone or something was out there with me, so I decided to head in. The sun was also setting, and dusk would be upon me soon. So I started walking towards my house, which would mean that I'd have to walk uphill. I wasn't in a rush and was taking my time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. So I turned around, and I saw a large creature about 80 yards from me, standing across the stream. It then proceeded to take a step towards me. I knew that in order to make it out of the woods, I'd have to run about 20 yards uphill, which would take me about 30 to 40 seconds. But I ran out of those woods in about 10. It was the most scared I've ever been, and the most adrenaline has ever flowed through me. Now, you might be wondering, could I have been dehydrated or hallucinating? Well, I've never hallucinated in my life, and I couldn't have been dehydrated because about 10 minutes prior to this event, I drank an entire bottle of water, and I always make sure I'm hydrated before I go exploring. There's no way it was a tree because every time I go out there, I go to where I spotted it, and there isn't a single tree small enough to look even remotely like what I saw. Since then, I haven't spotted it, but I have heard it. It's believed by Native Americans that Wendigos call out for help in the voice of humans in order to lure people toward them. I've heard what sounds like a little girl calling for help in those woods before. It's still terrifying to talk or think about. This happened back in high school on prom night. I was a sophomore, just helping take down decorations. I was 16 and it might have been 1 a.m. by the time I was driving home from the train station where the prom was held in rural Southern Virginia. At the time, I drove a 1994 F-150, which was built like a tank. I wasn't super familiar with the roads around the train station, but the one I was on had cornfields on both sides for a few acres back. Then it turned into deep woods. So, I'm heading home, doing maybe 45, when all of a sudden, half of my truck pops up and down, like I've just hit the mother of all speed bumps on one side. And having just got my license, I was panicked. So I pulled over to make sure I hadn't blown a tire. I put the truck in park and looked back for a second, and I see this huge mass just laying in the middle of the road that 100% was not there when I stopped. My first instinct is, I just killed someone's dog, and my heart dropped. I've got my hand on the door handle, ready to go see if this dog is okay, when suddenly, the hair on my arm stands up. On instinct, I look in the rearview mirror to see the thing getting up. At first, I was happy that it was alive, but then it stood up on 2 legs. Mind you, this was all illuminated by my brake lights in the middle of nowhere, and I was pretty freaked out. But when it stood up, I could tell it was kind of hunched over, and even then, it was almost as tall as the 9 or 10-foot corn in the fields. Massive rib cage, emaciated, long face, hollow-looking thing just stands up and looks dead at me before shuffling across the road back into the fields. I drove home, cried a bit, and went to sleep. The next morning, I found a massive dent in my fender, and I knew that I had really hit something. It messed me up for a good while, and now I still don't like driving at night. A few days ago, my sister and I took a ride on our horses. I'd say our horses are pretty much spook-proof. They sit still when we shoot rifles off their backs. So when they got spooked at a tall, dark, twisted figure in the corner of the woods, we flipped out and booked it back to the barn. We rode them straight into the barn so we wouldn't get knocked off when they ran back into their stalls. My sister was in a separate stall opposite me with her horse. We locked the stalls and bolted the doors shut from the inside. This was a feature I never thought we'd need. Since there were deadbolts on the inside of the stalls and wood window covers, there was no way inside. Whatever it was that had been following us was chasing us closely through the field, and I think we barely escaped. I didn't even notice my horse was bleeding on her left hip. I felt her kick while we were riding away, but I didn't think something had actually got her. She was sweaty and I could see the white in her eyes. I stood away from the window and the door. My father must have seen us, or that thing, because we heard gunshots coming from the right side of the barn, going towards the field. I called out to my sister, asking if she was okay. She was, but her horse was hurt, just like mine. She asked if I had seen what it was that scared the horses. I told her I barely saw anything. To be honest, I still don't know what it was, but it was thin and dark and smelled rotten. It left claw marks deep in our horses' sides. They'll have matching scars, but I don't think they'll let us take them back to the woods. They haven't left their stalls for over 2 days. My dad described the thing as a really mutated and mangled dog. He said he shot at it when it started to run into the barn. He made it bleed, but we haven't found the body. To be fair, he was pretty far away from it, so he didn't really get a good look. I was visiting my parents and their many cats in the Texas Hill Country during the hot summer months. The house was along a creek, and one evening one of the cats named Topaz, who followed me around on my walks around the property, was with me. We'd often walk along the creek, but this particular evening, Topaz was unwilling to cross in her usual spot. It was eerily quiet. I noticed a little later that she was acting as if something was threatening her, so I looked up, and that's when I saw it. This thing had long arms and it was tall. I don't remember anything like talons or claws, but I do remember antlers and matted fur. It wasn't gaunt or skeletal. It had very large dark eyes, oriented forward like a predator's would be. The weirdest thing about the whole situation was just being entirely overcome with fear and dread, literally to the point of vomiting. After I puked, I sprinted back up to the house with Topaz and avoided the creek for ages. Though, strangely, I felt quite certain that whatever that thing was, it couldn't cross running water. After a month, it felt like it had gone and it was safe to go over there again. Now, as far as I know, there's no family history on either side for hallucinations. And even if there were, this would have been my only experience with one in my entire life. It's been almost a full decade since that happened. Mostly, I'm wondering if anything of this description and presence has been encountered before, especially in Texas.